Thank you so much. So, how many of you have seen or been with Code Pink in the halls of Congress? So, you know, we do get rowdy and wild and sometimes start yelling things out like, yeah, there's something there, stop the funding, or we'll yell out something like war criminal when some of the generals are testifying. And we often get in trouble, get pulled out of there, sometimes get arrested. And recently, some of the heads of these committees have said, well, why don't you come to the office and talk to us about how you can be in the hearings and participate, but not lose the decorum of the hearings. And we kind of look at them and say, the decorum of the hearings? I mean, did anybody watch that Blackwater hearing and the decorum of how they treated this guy, Eric Prince? Like he was a nice gentleman, businessman who was just happened to making a business out of an illegal, unjust war in Iraq, and treating him with all kinds of respect. And we feel, you know, the saying that silence is complicity. We've come to the point where we think that politeness is complicity. There is no decorum when it comes to trying to stop an illegal war. There's no decorum in torture. There's no decorum in Guantanamo. There's no decorum in the kind of pretense of our Congress that they are stopping a war when they keep it going. So we need to be not only vocal, but we need to be rowdy. We need to be in their faces. We need to be everywhere where we can find the people that are keeping this war going and telling them that we have had enough. And for any of you, I want to start out just dispelling this little voice that might be in some of your heads or in the heads of some of your friends, because I must admit, sometimes in a fit of delirium, I find that little voice that I have to squash back there as well. And that's the little voice when you turn on the Fox News and you turn on the CNN and you allow some of that propaganda to seep in your head, you start thinking, yes, I was against this war from the beginning. It's a terrible thing that they were there, but now we've destroyed this country, and now the Sunnis are fighting the Shias, are fighting the Kurds, and everybody's fighting each other, and it would be terrible if we left. Maybe we do owe it to the Iraqis to stay until things get better. Be honest, raise your hand if you've ever had that slight sense with, okay. And certainly you know people that do. There is one simple answer I have to that, and that is that every poll that has been done in Iraq shows that the Iraqi people want the American troops to leave. And if there's one thing we must do is reflect the voice of the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people know full well that as long as the U.S. troops continue to be there, there will continue to be violence. And I want to read from the New York Times this week an account of one incident of that violence that was the incident that triggered the Blackwater hearings. And remember that for the Iraqi people, they don't know the difference between a contractor for Blackwater and the U.S. military. They see it as one and the same thing. So this was a fatal shootout that happened on, reported in the New York Times on October 3rd, dated October 2nd. It started out as a family errand. Ahmed Hussein driving with his mother, Mohassin, to pick up their father in the hospital where he worked as a pathologist. As they approached Nisour Square at midday on September 16th, they didn't know that a convoy of armored vehicles carrying Blackwater guards with automatic rifles was approaching the intersection. Moments later, a bullet tore through Ahmad's head. He slumped forward, and the car rolled forward. His body actually accelerated the car propelled it forward as his mother clutched him and screamed. "We tried to help him," said a witness. "We saw the left side of his head was destroyed, and his mother was crying out, 'My son, help my son.' The car with the weight of the dead body moved forward, and as a result of that, the black water guards started raining down their bullets, not only on that car, but all of the surrounding cars. Ahmed's father later counted 40 bullet holes in the car. His mother, Mohsen Kadim, was also shot to death. It appears that she was shot to death as she cradled her son in her arms. Moments later, the car caught fire after the Blackwater guards fired a type of grenade into the vehicle. 2 weeks after the event that claimed their lives and the lives of 15 others and left 24 people critically wounded, her husband, Hatham Ahmed, and her younger son, Hadar, are still bewildered. "My son was very gentle, very clever. He was easy to be around," said Mr. Ahmed, looking down at the floor. "My son, he planned to be a surgeon." Then he looked at a picture of his wife. "She is a beautiful woman, he said, speaking as if she were still alive. Then he took a picture of his son that he kept on his cell phone camera. Seeming to forget there was anyone else in the room, he spoke to the video image, quote, "I am waiting to meet you in paradise, my son." This is just one incident of so many incidents, one that we happen to hear about. Imagine how that father now feels about the United States. Would you blame that father if he has since joined an insurgent group? I was also reading recently a story called The Deserter, one of the soldiers from the US who decided he could not continue to fight in the war in Iraq and so left. His name is Joshua Key. And he talked about what it was like when he prepared to go to war, when he was trained in boot camp here in the United States. He said, "Nobody once mentioned the word civilian in the same breath as Iraq when I trained to become a soldier. Iraqis, I was taught, were not civilians. They were not even human beings. We called them hajis, habibs, ragheads, sand niggers. We used to yell, 'Kill, kill, kill the sand niggers.' No wonder that by the time I flew overseas to war, I thought that all Muslims were terrorists and that the only solution was to kill as many Iraqis as possible." So when that little voice in your mind starts to gnaw at you and say, maybe we can help, maybe our military can be part of the solution, our military is part of the problem. It cannot be part of the solution. We must have a timetable for the withdrawal of US troops. And it is only when we have that timetable will the Iraqis, the insurgents, the people in the government begin to sit down and find a real reconciliation process. So keep that very, very clear in your own mind as we go through the next difficult months of trying to convince our Congress of what we know is right. So I want to take a look at where we stand today, because there is a lot of disillusionment in the peace movement. And what happens with that disillusionment is it plays on itself. Raise your hand if you've been to an anti-war protest. Raise your hand if there's a little voice in there that says, "Oh, another anti-war protest coming up. Do I really have to go out to another anti-war protest?" A lot of honesty in this room today. Because I tell you, I feel the same thing. I say, oh my God, another anti-war protest. September 15th, September 29th, October 27th. And there is something in us that, like, was it Einstein that says, you know, insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results? There is something in us that says, we've marched, we've vigiled, we've done all that, and they don't listen to us. Why should we do it again? You know why we should do it again? Because we have to do it again. Because this is our responsibility. Blackwater is our responsibility. The 160,000 soldiers in Iraq are our responsibility. And if we get demoralized, if we get dejected, who is going to do it then? Whether we like it or not, it is our government, and whether we like it or not, they are doing the killing in our name. And so let's take a look at what we have done. For a minute, let's see the glass as half full, which we have since February 15th, before the war began. We've organized massive demonstrations, 8 of them with over 100,000 people. We have 300 cities, over 300 cities in this country that have passed anti-war resolutions. We have states at the state level that have passed anti-war resolutions, and many of them still considering passing those resolutions. We have hundreds of unions around this country that have passed anti-war resolutions. We have student groups all over the country and a renewed student effort with the new Students for a Democratic Society. We have women and men standing on street corners and vigils that they are doing every week that they have been doing before the war began. And you might say, well, what has it all done? And I will say the one thing that has done, it has changed public opinion in this country. And that is absolutely critical. The change in public opinion is something we can't take for granted, because we are faced with this tremendous propaganda machine that we just saw marched out on September 15th when they brought General Petraeus as the salesman to resell this horrible war. And we see the sales pitch going on every day when you turn on Fox News. So we have to keep being out there to tell the American people that this war is wrong, no matter how it is repackaged by the Bush administration. So we can take credit for the fact that public opinion is on our side. What, of course, we can't take credit for is changing policy, and that's what we still have to do. It is quite astounding that we have a public in this country that by every opinion poll shows the majority of them want a timeline for withdrawal of the U.S. troops. And still, we have a Congress that was voted in with a mandate for peace, a Congress voted in to end the war, and they refused to do their job. What does this say to people around the world when we say we're going all over the world because we want to impose democracy? What does it say when not only our White House, but our Congress, run by Democrats, refuse to listen to the American people and end this war? It says that our democracy is broken. And who's going to fix the democracy? It's obviously not the White House, it's obviously not the Republicans, and it is obviously not the leadership of the Democratic Party. It is we, the people, that must fix our democracy. There is one way that Congress has to end this war. Can you shout it out to me, how Congress can end the war? Let's all shout it out. Stop the funding, stop the funding, stop the funding, stop the funding. That's right. Congress has the power of the purse. Congress can stop this war by cutting off the funds. We know that, but the Democratic leadership is trying to hide the fact that it is indeed Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, that could just refuse to put on the floor of the House a bill that continues to fund this war. And in fact, there is a simple way to end this war, and that is for Congress to sign on to the letter started by the one person in Congress that said no to war after 9/11, and that is Congresswoman Barbara Lee. This letter that now has 82 Congresspeople signed on to it, but needs to have a majority, reads in part, "Dear Mr. President, we are writing to inform you that we will only support appropriating additional funds for U.S. military operations in Iraq for the fiscal year 2008 and beyond, only for the protection and safe redeployment of all of our troops from Iraq." This is what we need Congress to sign on to, a letter that says we will only fund the safe and speedy withdrawal of our troops from Iraq. If you don't know whether your congressperson has signed on to this, we have copies of this letter here for you today with a list on the bottom of those congresspeople who have signed on to this. Look and see if your congressperson has signed, and if he or she hasn't, this should be your #1 priority. Whether your congressperson is a Democrat or a Republican, pressure them to sign on to this letter. This is the way to stop the war, which is cut off the funds. We also have another incredible task in front of us right now, and that's not only to bring our troops home Iraq, but it is to stop the next war. And you in this room are an educated crowd. You know that the drumbeat of war in Iran is beating harder and harder, that the Bush administration is gunning for another war in Iran, and we must not let them happen. Look at the propaganda that we see now about attacking Iran. First of all, this issue about nuclear weapons. Iran is in compliance with the International Energy Association in terms of its right by international law to have nuclear energy. Now, we in this room are probably against nuclear energy, whether it's in Iran or here in the United States. But let us be clear that by international law, Iran does have that right. Let us also be clear that the way the Bush administration and the US government in general has worked is to say, we will have our 10,000 nuclear weapons, and we will continue to research and develop new nuclear weapons, and we will dictate to the rest of the world who can have and who can't have nuclear weapons. And what does that sound like to other countries? What does it look like to a country like Iran that is surrounded itself by countries that have nuclear weapons? And I'm not just talking about Pakistan and nearby India, but about Israel that has 200 nuclear weapons, that has never signed on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And when the United States says that we cannot allow Iran to have nuclear weapons, we must respond that we need a nuclear weapon-free Middle East, including Israel's nuclear weapons, and that we need to comply ourselves with the Non-Proliferation Treaty by disarming our own nuclear weapons. We want a world free of nuclear weapons. Also, look how Iran must feel when it looks at what happened in Iraq. The US government knew full well that Saddam did not have a nuclear weapon, and in fact, that's one of the reasons why the US government went ahead and invaded Iran. And look at the opposite case, the case of North Korea, where the US government knew that North Korea did have a nuclear weapon, that after North Korea was put on the list of evil nations, the North Korean government felt obliged to actually test a nuclear device to let the world know that they had nuclear weapons, because that was their only assurance that the United States would not attack. And since then, the U.S. has negotiated with North Korea, and the threat of nuclear weapons in North Korea has been abated. What we want is negotiations, 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 diplomacy, diplomacy, diplomacy. We also know that right now, the U.S. government is also increasing the rhetoric about Iran being involved in attacking U.S. soldiers inside Iraq. Well, one thing we can say that an easy way to stop U.S. soldiers from being attacked in Iraq is to bring them home. And if you want to talk about foreigners interfering in the internal affairs of Iraq, let's not look at Iran. Let's look at the 160,000 foreign U.S. troops that are inside of Iran. That is foreign interference in the affairs of Iraq. Let us also not be fooled, and tell our friends to not be fooled by the talk about democracy in Iran. I am sure that many of us did not like a number of the things said by Mahmoud Ahmadinejad when he was here visiting. But you know what? Iranians voted for him. And there are many Iranians who don't like their government and have been working very hard to change things inside Iran. In fact, many of them have been imprisoned and continue to be for trying to change things inside their country. And I wanted to read a little piece from an essay in our book, Stop the Next War Now, from the Nobel Prize winner Shireen Ebadi, who has herself been in prison for trying to change things inside her country of Iran. She says, many people who are truly fighting for democracy and human rights face prison, intimidation, and even death. I and many other political prisoners were locked up in Iran, and unfortunately many of the writers, journalists, political and social activists, and university students who have been fighting for our rights remain in prison. I plead for their freedom, and I mourn those who have lost their lives in this struggle. But large and powerful countries should not attack other countries on the pretext of bringing democracy and human rights. You cannot export democracy with weapons. You cannot pour human rights on the heads of people with cluster bombs. Military attacks, no matter what their intentions, do not create democracy. We have to create a grassroots uprising against a war with Iran. And I want to give some ideas that we, as Code Pink and Global Exchange and other groups, have come up with. One is, how many of you live in Washington, D.C.? Well, for those of you in Washington, D.C., wouldn't it be wonderful if Washington, D.C. were the first big city to pass a resolution that said, we want peace with Iran? Clap for that. Don't you want that to happen? So we have gone to every member of the city council and talked with the mayor about passing such a resolution. We have had a positive response, and all we need now is the grassroots backing for this to happen. So if any of you are interested in making Washington, D.C. the first major city to say no to war with Iran, please see, maybe Jess and Leslie, you can stand up because you stand out with your crowns and your pink hat. Please see these two wonderful people here after the session. And while Leslie is standing, I do want to say something else about her because of your incredible commitment. Leslie and Jess went on one of our Global Exchange trips to Iran. And you know, it is possible to go to Iran. And we do have trips there every couple of months, and you can look at the website globalexchange.org. But when Leslie and Jess came back from their trip to Iran, they decided they were going to change their lives. They were going to get rid of their worldly goods. they were going to live out of their car and out of their tent and travel around the country talking to people about the need for peace with Iran. They felt so compelled after falling in love with the Iranian people. And soon after they got back, they heard Joseph Lieberman talking about the need to prepare for war with Iran and about the proof that he had that Iran was interfering in the internal affairs of Iraq and was killing American soldiers inside Iraq, and that Iran was preparing for nuclear weapons. And they felt so grief-stricken by hearing Joseph Lieberman and the drumbeat for war that Leslie decided that she on her own would undertake a hunger strike until she was able to have a meeting with Joseph Lieberman, and came to DC, and the days went on, and the days went on, and week 1, no meeting with Joseph Lieberman, week 2, no meeting with Joseph Lieberman, and we would accompany her into his office every single day, and every day they would say after 10 minutes, "You're now loitering," what was it? They would call the police and take her out of the office, and she would come back in the next day and come back in the next day. And in the 3rd week, Leslie was sitting in the office, and they told her to leave, and she said she was feeling dizzy. Could she just lie down for a minute? And they said no, and all of a sudden she collapsed on the floor of Joseph Lieberman's Senate office. They had to call in an ambulance and take her to the hospital. The next day she appeared on the front page of, was it The Hill or Roll Call? Roll Call, one of the insider newspapers on the Hill, and that embarrassed the hell out of Joseph Lieberman. It was on the 24th day of her hunger strike that she actually managed to get a meeting with Joseph Lieberman. And she was told to come by herself, which she didn't do. She brought with her a friend, and when she was meeting with the senator, asked if her friend could come in. Her friend was a young man from Iran that was here with a group called Miles for Peace that was bicycling across the United States to say, we want friendship and peace with our friends in the United States, not war. She managed to bring him inside the meeting with Lieberman, and he told her as a young person that every time there is an increase in the drumbeats of war in the United States, there is a crackdown on people inside Iran that are fighting for greater democracy and greater freedom inside their own country. And so his rhetoric is actually hurting the very people in Iran that he should want to be helping. And I just want to give recognition to Leslie for what one person can do with tremendous determination and continues to do to try to stop this war with Iran. So thank you so much for your work, Leslie. Because when it comes down to how we're going to stop the next war, and I tricked you all with the title of this, saying that there was a new strategy for stopping the war. The new strategy is really the old strategy, which is personal commitment. It is all about personal commitment. Whether it's a commitment to going to the next mobilizations, and October 27th, there are going to be mobilizations in 11 cities around the country, and all of these cities are close to other cities where you might be living. You can go online, see october27th.org and see all the cities where this is going to be happening. New York, Philadelphia, Orlando, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago. Let's make those mobilizations huge regional mobilizations to let the White House and Congress know that the anti-war movement is alive and kicking. We also have the chance to show that we understand the connections between oil, the environment, and the war. And these are the connections that many of the speakers and the groups out here in the Green Festival are making. It's the connections that we in this room know, but it's the connections that need to be made out there in the world. Let's not forget that if Iraq's major export were broccoli, we would have never invaded that country, we would not be occupying that country, we would not be building permanent bases in that country. This is about oil. This is about oil. And let's not forget that as long as we continue to be 5% of the world's population, consuming 25% of the world's resources, we will not be able to live in peace with the rest of the world. We must change the way we live, the way we work, the way we consume. And that's why this Green Festival is so important and so exciting, because we can make those changes. But we have an opportunity to bring these two things together, and that is on October 21st to 23rd are the days of joining these two issues called No War, No Warming. And here in Washington, D.C., we're going to be doing massive civil disobedience to show that we will not continue to accept business as usual in the city. Come and join us in the No War, No Warming actions. You can go onto the website, nowarnowarming.org. And I wanted to ask, is Ted Glick here in the room? I don't see Ted, but I want to give him in absentia a hand, because this is day 35 of a hunger strike that Ted Glick is doing to make those kind of connections and inspire people to do more, to commit themselves to not only ending the war, but stopping our destructive waves that are destroying this planet. I want to use the remainder of my time to really talk about commitment. Because whether it's going on a hunger strike like Leslie did, like Ted Glick did, whether it's committing ourselves to going out to those mobilizations when there's that little voice saying, oh, it won't do anything good, we have to keep up our commitment. It's not just a question of doing something on the internet, clicking a little button. E-activism will not end the war. E-activism is a good thing, but it is not enough. We have to do more. And we have to take our inspiration from those people in our traditions in this country that have made the changes that make our country beautiful. Traditions like nonviolent civil disobedience. And I know that when I engage in acts of nonviolent civil disobedience, I do it building on the tradition of the civil rights movement, the tradition of the suffragettes movement, the tradition of the gay rights movement, the traditions of those movements that have been so successful in making change. And it really will be a committed social movement that is willing to take those kind of risks, that is going to change the foreign policy in this country. Some of you might know that recently I traveled to Canada, or I tried to travel to Canada. Just last week, Anne Wright, who is herself an amazing person, a retired colonel in the US military, a former State Department diplomat that resigned when the US government invaded Iraq and has now been an incredible part of the peace movement. Anne Wright and myself were invited to Toronto to speak with the Stop the War Coalition there. And when we got to the border of, on Buffalo, the Buffalo side, we tried to cross what is called the Rainbow Bridge, and we were stopped by the Canadian Border Guards. It turns out that they are using an FBI database, and it turns out that the FBI database that was originally intended to be used for hardened criminals, sex offenders, fugitives, people engaged in terrorist activities, that FBI database is now including nonviolent offenses of people who have engaged in acts of nonviolent civil disobedience against the war in Iraq. And so when we got to the border, they printed out our file on this FBI database. And on my file, it had that I was arrested in front of the White House, protesting the war, that I was arrested in Congress, and that I was arrested in the United Nations trying to hand in petitions signed by women all over the world saying no to war. Anne Wright had similar, quote, offenses for which she was fined, in her cases, $50 fines for what were considered minor misdemeanors. Because of those offenses, we are on this FBI database, and because of that, the Canadian government said that we were inadmissible into Canada. We were turned away at the border, and since then, in this past few days, this has become quite a scandal inside of Canada, as well it should be. Because think about it, if Canada is indeed saying that anybody, which is what they're saying, who has been convicted of a criminal offense, no matter how small, even a minor misdemeanor, is not allowed into Canada, think of who they would be excluding. If Dr. King were still alive, Martin Luther King would not be allowed into Canada, Rosa Parks would never be allowed into Canada. And certainly, the people in Congress who last year got arrested in front of the Sudanese embassy protesting genocide in Darfur would not be allowed into Canada. That includes Tom Lantos, himself a Holocaust survivor. That includes Barbara Lee, the only congresswoman who said no to war, and includes 12 other members of the Black Congressional Caucus. If indeed Canada does not let anybody in for minor offenses, that would mean that the 1,800 people who got arrested at the Republican National Convention, many of them swept up in a massive police arrest of people who were doing absolutely nothing, would not be allowed into Canada. And I was thinking yesterday, when Amy Goodman was here and was talking about this incident, I remembered that Amy Goodman was arrested by mistake with us in front of the White House, which means that Amy Goodman would not be allowed into Canada. And I also was thinking of the people that I have been arrested with in the past, one of them being Martin Sheen, the president from West Wing. Do you know that Martin Sheen has been arrested about 70 different times? Martin Sheen has been protesting, starting back in the days of his friendship with Cesar Chavez. He's been arrested around issues trying to get shelters for the homeless in this country, trying to get living wages for poor farm workers. He's been arrested in his work to stop nuclear energy. He's been arrested, I was arrested with him at the Vandenberg Air Force Base against Star Wars. And I remember a quote that I looked up by Martin Sheen that said that nonviolent civil disobedience for him was a way to test his commitment, for himself to show how deeply committed he was. And he said that he didn't know if his actions actually changed governments, but he knew that his actions changed himself. He knew when he did these things, he felt that it was the right thing to be doing. It felt that it gave him spiritual depth. It felt that he was committing himself to the things that were most important to his life, which were not being a Hollywood star, but were being a deeply committed person to social justice and peace. And so when we commit these kinds of acts of civil disobedience, we do take risks. And I invite any of you who have not been arrested yet to join this club of those of us who are, for the time being, not allowed into Canada, because it is indeed a good club to be part of. And I think We will overturn this because we got a call yesterday from some very outraged members of Parliament in Canada who said that Anne Wright and I will be invited to speak before the Parliament of Canada. And we will bring with us a list of all the people who, by these rules, should not be allowed into this country, to shame them into stop using an FBI database as their criteria for who should come into the country. And in fact, some of our friends in Canada who have been protesting the free trade agreement with Canada recently wrote an action alert, said that the Canadian government is allowing all these dangerous pesticides to be coming in from the United States into Canada and not letting peacemakers into the country, that certainly pesticides were much more dangerous to Canadians than peacemakers were. I want to invite you also to join with us in Congress as we go there every day to show our determination to end this war and stop one with Iran. We have a Code Pink house here in Washington, D.C. right now. We have potlucks every Wednesday night that we invite you to come and join us. But you can join us every single day. Just call us at the house, ask what the schedule is, and come with us. We must be that visual daily presence in the halls of Congress. And you'd be surprised how afraid many of the Congress people are of these men and women dressed in pink. We walk into the offices of Hillary Clinton and ask to meet with her chief of staff, and there is her chief of staff. We walk into the office of Carl Levin and asked to meet with the chief of staff, and there is the chief of staff. They are afraid of us because they know we represent the majority of public opinion in this country. And I want to end with a quote by Alice Walker. And Alice Walker is one of the people who got arrested with us standing in front of the White House. And I end with this because it's not about being depressed and disgusted and disillusioned. When you are committed and engaged, it gives you a sense of empowerment. It really makes you feel that you are not only doing the right thing, but that you can be effective. I was arrested, she said before. I was arrested protesting apartheid in South Africa, arrested protesting the war in Central America, but this time felt different. This time felt that all the information is in. If our species does not outgrow its tendency to fight wars, we can kiss all we have created, including ourselves and our children, goodbye. Standing there in front of the White House with 24 other beautiful women, I felt the sweet of all feelings, peace. The police began to gather their horses, their paddy wagons, their plastic handcuffs, and what did we do? We sang. Being women, we noticed and made much of the fact that a rainbow appeared suddenly in the sky. The arrest went smoothly. They put us in the paddy wagons, and we sang. We sang in the holding cell. We recited poetry to each other. We told stories of our lives. And all the while, there was this sweetness. Even though the floor of the cell was cold, we had nothing to eat, the toilet wouldn't flush, I found Fannie Lou Hamer's voice coming out of my throat and led our cell in singing This Little Light of Mine. I realized that at the root of the peace cradling me were not only ancestors like Einstein, but Martin Luther King. I had followed him faithfully since I was in my teens. His fearless, persistent struggle mesmerized me. Perfect love casts out fear. That is what he had, and that is ultimately what we in our sea of pink symbolized. We were women and children who loved ourselves in the form of Iraqi women and children. We knew that to love ourselves as humans meant to love ourselves as all humans. We understood that whatever we did to stop war, we did not for the other, but for the collective us. So let us remember, as we go out in the world, redoubling our commitment to to change our government's policies, that we will never be safe in the world if we rain the world with bombs and bullets. We will never make friends by making people around the world fear us. We must make people around the world love us. It is through love, compassion, generosity, and kindness that we will be safe at home and make the world a much safer place to live in. Thank you very much.